What is your professional background and what is your current professional landscape?
Okay, my background, I spent over 30 years in the gas and electricity utility industry, both in the UK and the USA. My specialism actually is gas engineering, and my current background and landscape really reflects the utility sector as a whole. So I've done work in the USA, in Canada, in Europe, and as far as Australia as well, since I've set up my own consultancy to run that business.
How would you describe the current state of asset management?
Asset management is actually quite well developed and established as a profession now. It has its own institute of asset management that shares experience from a number of different sectors across the world. I suppose its birthplace, you'd argue, is in the UK. It sort of stemmed from an original piece of work called PAS 55, but has now got international recognition under ISO 55000. It was very strong in the early days in the utility and transportation and water sectors, and or particularly in the rail sector in the UK, but now has expanded into construction, consumer products, manufacturing, all around the world.
Will the introduction of RIIO-2 have an effect on certain industries?
Yeah, RIIO-2, which follows on from RIIO-1, is specific to the energy sector in the UK. It's the term used by the regulator to describe the framework under which regulation is managed, and it stands for revenue generated by incentives, innovation, and outputs. And particularly the outputs part of asset management is quite important in terms of delivery of long-term value to the consumer. RIIO-2 builds on RIIO-1, so the regulator has now got best part of 7 years worth of data from the gas and electricity sector in the UK to understand how it's performing and what it's planning to do with its assets in the longer term. RIIO-2 just strengthens that framework and the need to be transparent with the regulator in terms of what their future plans are, particularly in a sector that's obviously focused on big things like decarbonisation of energy and is a big spender of energy infrastructure.
What are the biggest challenges asset management is facing?
Specifically the UK, probably the biggest challenge is the decarbonisation of energy. Because it's in the northern hemisphere, the biggest challenge it has is heating in the winter, whereas somewhere like North America would have as much load in the summer from air conditioning as it does from heating in the summer. And the price of electricity heating and actually the technology to do it is very expensive. So managing the transition from a predominantly gas-fueled heating sector to one that's decarbonised energy will probably take a mix over the next 30 years to actually get to a state when the proportion of carbon used in heating is reduced significantly. So RIIO and the regulator industries in the UK basically have to demonstrate that they're maintaining their statutory duties, the safety of the system, and meeting demand, but at the same time looking to reduce the amount of carbon they burn and manage that pathway towards a more electric-driven energy sector, as well as taking on new things like new sources of energy from wind and renewables and new load like electric vehicles, for example.
In terms of asset management, what are your thoughts on how it is being handled right now?
Well, again, if I was specific about the UK is quite advanced and it's moving into a new sphere of asset management in terms of its technical capability, using a lot more predictive analytics and a systematic approach and holistic approach is the area they're moving into. Other sectors of asset management around the world were probably playing a little bit of catch up and still having challenges establishing basic asset investment plans and the sort of foundations of asset management. Whereas I think in the UK it's quite advanced, but there's still some way to go, and some companies are still struggling with some of the basics that feed that information, like data quality, for example.
Are certain sectors being maintained more efficiently than others, or are they all faced with the same challenges?
That's a very difficult question to answer as well, really. Partly because the way that those companies have been regulated and their performance measured over time has changed. So they've been delivering performance against the measures that were in place, and typically those in the early years of regulation were about reducing cost to the consumer. What changed under Rio is a focus more on the long-term resilience and sustainability of the industry and this transition. So the management of the cost purely has moved to something that's now looking towards a more balanced approach to long-term planning, keeping the costs low for today's consumers, but not burdening future consumers with a lot of sunk cost or investment that it doesn't need to have.
Are there any tools or solutions that are looking to address these constraints?
Again, there's a lot of tools. A lot of established systems, decision support tools that have been around for a number of years. A lot of them in asset management are focused around enterprise asset management systems like SAP and Oracle, for example, or enterprise resource planning tools that are focused on bringing together all of the business's systems into one place, into one core, and be able to share data across them. That has probably now moved on to a new level where companies are looking to get more information and more knowledge about their assets and how they'll perform going forward. So they're looking towards predictive maintenance regimes, whole system thinking, looking beyond perhaps their own sphere. So I've seen examples where energy firms are working with water industry firms and local authorities to look at the impact of the whole system, which they haven't actually had to do before. And to some extent, the regulators are still catching up with that understanding of what they need to do because they have a particular remit under which they work, be that in water sector or the energy sector. But particularly, I've seen some examples in the northwest of England with the Mayor of Greater Manchester that has taken on all of those different elements of government and regulation to actually bring them together to create more of a holistic plan for that region, which is looking pretty good. And it considers consumers, people's movement around transportation hubs, as well as energy and environmental needs.
In what ways would having a holistic and systemic approach help companies achieve their KPIs? What are the benefits?
I think the reason why I describe the UK as being a lot more advanced is that they've optimized within each of their functional silos quite often. So they've got the most optimized finance system or the optimized engineering system. By looking at a systematic and holistic approach, they're considering not only the asset life from its design all the way through to its decommissioning and disposal, but they're looking at the impact of the way those assets perform on a wider group of people. Their employees, the way they manage performance, the way the assets perform, the way the consumers' supply and energy needs are met, or if you're in a transportation industry, the way that rail services, for example, are managed and how that links into airports and other industries.
What are some examples of how people have been adopting a systemic approach?
There are lots of examples of the systemic approach or systematic approach. They've looked a lot in terms of whole life asset management, when it's best to invest, when it's best to maintain, when it's best to dispose. So a lot of industries have got those first generation plans, as I would call them. But they've hit a bit of a glass ceiling, which looking at more of a predictive world and looking at being able to model that world. There's talk of creating digital twins of the company so they can effectively mirror lots of different asset decisions on what that would do to the way the company and their assets perform. And some companies have started entering into that world, but many have only just started.
How do the network output measures affect asset management strategies? How can certain approaches help?
Well, the network output measures, again specific to the energy sector, but similar measures of quality and resilience apply in the water sector as well. They give a degree of consistency in terms of the way different companies have measured in their performance. There's a set of measures and targets that are set that can be compared in terms of how they're performing. It also creates a responsibility on the company to demonstrate in a very transparent way how its investment will maintain the health of those assets in the longer term, so that the decisions that they make are the best overall value ultimately to the consumer who pays the consumer charge. Those network output measures have evolved over time. They're becoming more sophisticated, more finite, and the targets that are set in Rio 2 will be tougher and moved on from the ones that were created in Rio 1.
How does Cosmo Tech answer the needs of asset managers and decision makers? Do they provide a service better than their competitors?
I think they do. There's a lot of very good solutions out there, and a lot of the market, because it's quite advanced in asset management in the UK, have already adopted and taken on systems and solutions from other providers rather than Cosmo Tech. Cosmo Tech, coming out of France, has built its business up there, but is moving into the UK. The differential, I think, that Cosmo Tech has is its balance of deep problem-solving analytics that it applies, its whole system approach. I haven't seen anybody else who can actually match the variety of inputs that Cosmo Tech can model. And it also importantly takes real-world constraints and real-world experiences from the experts in the business and actually models those too. So it combines the sort of purely theoretical approach to statistical modeling with actually real-world link to that industry, and then creates scenarios that can play out over 5, 10, 20, 50 years of different decisions that asset managers can make for them to optimize what would likely be the best path for them to make those decisions. It also therefore gives them the ability to go into the regulator with a number of different pathways or options, which regulators like, for them to say, out of 5 or 6 different ways of approaching this, this looks to be the most economic long-term value for consumers, which therefore meets the regulator's needs.
What do companies need to do to benefit from these approaches?
I think the biggest thing that companies need to do to benefit from these approaches is to keep an open mind. The technology that exists already quite often optimizes within those silos and then adds them together. So it's some of the parts, rather than looking at first principles in terms of how the interaction between, say, an engineering function, an operations function, a financial planning, and a resource management function work together. Because the interaction between those different silos often has never been modeled. And that's something that needs to be considered. Just purely writing down and representing the best in each of the silos doesn't necessarily give you the optimum result. And I think also being very keen on scenario planning and being able to come up with ways that those companies themselves can learn by playing in that scenario world would give them a lot more confidence in their futures.
Do you think companies are ready to embrace new technologies and approaches to help with their asset management strategies?
Yes and no again. I would say the companies are on a spectrum. So some companies are very advanced. They've already started to think of these things. You can normally tell in the way that inquiries are posted for tenders. Those companies that really thought hard about the problem they're trying to solve and then go out to the market to find the right solution to do that. Other companies are still working hard through the basics of their asset management. So the first systematic approach that they put in exposed a number of weaknesses in their performance or the performance of their assets, and therefore the focus is actually on improving those rather than moving to the next level of sophistication. For those companies that have actually come through that first generation and are now looking to take it on a little bit further, then I think they're ready for the Cosmo Tech solution. Similarly, if they have not done any an analysis, then it's still appropriate to look at Cosmo Tech because it can work from base principles up and grow with the company. But as I think has been shown with the customers in France, particularly RTE, it's a capability that once you have in the organisation, you use more and more and learn more about your business and add components of it together to get more of a holistic approach of where your business is running.